NBA, Blizzard, South Park, trade deal, EU trade war, pork prices, all that and more on this week's China Update. Hey, what's up guys, it's Tony here with another episode of China Update where we tell you guys the biggest developments coming out of the Middle Kingdom so you're on top of the world's #2 economy. And what a week it has been. Oh my God, I do not think there's been this many eyes on China since the '08 Olympics. Let's jump in with our first story, which is NBA and Blizzard and the backlash against American companies that are seen pandering to censors in China. Now, we did a special earlier in the week. We're going to have a link in the description below where we do a bit of a deep dive into what happened with the South Park episode and the NBA scandal last week. Basically what happened, the NBA was forced into a bit of a corner when the manager of the Houston Rockets made a statement on Twitter supporting the Hong Kong protests. After that, Chinese government was infuriated and companies cut all ties with the Houston Rockets. The NBA initially made an apology, but this angered people back in the United States. The NBA then released a firmer statement saying that they supported freedom of speech, and because of that, they were banned in China. Now, this entire episode was interesting because this isn't the first time something like this has happened. In fact, this has been going on for many years. There have been companies, not just in the US, but in Europe and places like Japan that have had to balance this sort of issue. Now, what makes this different? Well, in this case, it has a lot of attention. In this case, and I hate to use a mixed metaphor when we're talking about basketball, but the Chinese sort of made an own goal here because a lot of people like sports. They like basketball. And a lot of people could understand what this means. They could see as clear as day what was going on, and it made a lot of people unhappy. They saw this as an example of the Chinese government exporting censorship. So it pissed people off. I remember thinking at the time, you couldn't possibly have an industry that more regular Americans are interested in than sports. But of course I was wrong, because a few days after this, there was an even bigger story. Blizzard is now in super hot water in the gaming community for doing something very, very similar. Basically, a gamer, Blitzchung, made comments supportive of the protests, and Blizzard blocked the player, removed their winnings for the game, and basically pissed off half the internet. Now, there are plenty of other videos that will go into the details of that. All we need to know here is that there are two major companies in the United States in massive industries that a lot of people care about that in the course of a few days have been seen to be acting in a way in accordance with Chinese censors at the expense of the freedom of speech of people outside the country. Now, let's take a step back and try and understand, let's be a little bit academic. What is China doing here? Because it's very easy to say, oh, it's just a communist authoritarian government just doing what they do. But what exactly is fueling this foreign policy decision? Now, the Chinese have this concept called 国际话语权, or international discourse power. It basically is a type of half soft power, half PR idea. The idea being to try and mold the conversation on any topic that relates to China. And the instructions have typically been to push hard a narrative whenever there is an issue that touches on a red line issue for China. The Chinese authorities from the beginning have, for better or for worse, identified Hong Kong as an issue that is a red line for them. The great irony with this, of course, is if this 国际话语权 or this international discourse power is designed to promote Chinese soft power and the Chinese image overseas, or China's image overseas, then it really has not worked in this case. At the end of the day, what are the big macro outcomes for this? Now, the obvious is this is a challenge that companies are going to have to deal with going forward. How they balance their interest in the United States and other large Western and industrialized markets versus pleasing censors in the People's Republic of China. But the bigger thing here is that because there are so many eyes on this, the politics is getting involved already in the United States. There was a bipartisan statement that was signed by a diverse range of politicians from across both aisles, which stated, unless American businesses aggressively confront this intimidation campaign, the Chinese government will increasingly punish free speech outside China's borders. It's not unreasonable to expect American companies to put our fundamental democratic rights ahead of profit, the rights that have fostered their success and our nation's wealth. Like I said in my special a few days ago, this is going to have three big effects. One is that it's going to become part of the White House's trade policy. Two is that there are going to be bills pushed through at Capitol Hill as a direct result of the NBA and probably now this Blizzard story. And three, this is going to be a presidential issue in 2020. So yes, our biggest story this week had to do with South Park, the NBA, and Blizzard Entertainment. What an interesting week to follow China. Let's jump on into our second story. Now, our second story is the trade deal. Now, you may know that on Friday, a phase one or an interim trade deal was signed between the Chinese and the Americans. Trump said in a tweet on Friday that an interim deal had been reached. He said it was phase one of a multi-phase trade deal. Now, anyone who was watching our episode last week will not be surprised by this because we said that there is a strong likelihood that an interim deal would be signed. And if you want to know the reasons for that, go ahead and watch our last episode. So if you did see that episode, I hope your investment portfolio also had a nice little bump like mine did. You see, you can make a little bit of money following the world's #2 economy. Anyway, what does this mean? Well, not as much as you might think. Is the trade war over? No way. Personally, I wouldn't even call this a trade deal. I would call this two boxers, 6 rounds in, deciding to give each other an extra minute because they both need a breather. In this case, the American side, the Trump administration specifically, and the Chinese side both really needed things that could be achieved in a short-term interim deal. But if you take a step back, the relationship is currently in tatters and there are still big structural issues that both sides cannot agree with at all in the short term. So this is really an interim deal at most, and it is on really, really unstable foundations. I wouldn't be surprised if it falls down in 3 months or in 3 weeks. Now, what did the deal basically entail? Well, it seems that in exchange for the American side not putting up its planned tariffs for Tuesday, which would be an extra 5%, 25 to 30% on 250 billion of imports from China, as well as the tariffs that were set to go in on the 15th of December, including on Apple products. The Chinese agreed on a couple of points, the big ones being major agricultural purchases, which of course is good for the Trump administration because this is of course the president's base, and 2, an agreement to implement IP protections. They're a little fuzzy on the details, but to be honest, the big part is the agribusiness purchases. The case that we have here, both sides get what they want. The Chinese can avoid extra tariffs, plus they really need these agricultural purchases to go through because of issues with pork prices. The American president can say that he's winning on trade and that he's made some sort of concessions with the Chinese and help his base by getting more agro purchases across the line and potentially reverse the last 3 weeks of poor performance in the stock market. The last thing that president wants is to go into an election year with a tanking stock market and a recession on the cards. But like I said, don't be too hopeful that this is going to lead to a big deal. There is still a long way to go, and like I said, this is on weak foundations. Okay, now our third story is about economic slowdown in China. The World Bank joined a slew of other reporting agencies and NGOs and large financial institutions in downgrading their forecasts for the Chinese projected growth. They're now reporting that they predict 6.1% growth in the second largest economy. This year, that's going to drop down to 5.9 in 2020 and then 5.8 in 2021. This is actually one of the more optimistic forecasts about China's economic prospects over the next few years. Now, a very prominent Western economist and financial expert who is in China, he works as a professor at Peking University, Michael Pettis, actually tweeted out that he believes that the growth is going to be much, much slower. He said that by 2021, you're probably going to see growth in China at less than 5%. And he said even that is being quite hopeful. Now, what is causing the slowdown? Well, it seems the obvious answer is the trade war, right? Not really. The trade war has agitated a slowdown that has been on the cards for a few years now in China. The Chinese, over the last couple of years, have been trying to wean themselves off their addiction to using credit to grow their economy, something that they started in 2008, 2009 to avoid the effects of the financial crisis in their own country, but they were never able to kick that habit. So now the Chinese are going through a deleveraging and they're having tremendous difficulty at the local level with financing and finding ways to transition from the credit growth model to a more sustainable model based on consumption, investment, competition, and innovation. So really the growth that you're seeing in China at the moment is more of a reflection of internal domestic structural issues and policies, and less so the external stuff like the trade war, though that doesn't help. Okay, last two stories quickly. This is important as well. The EU released a cybersecurity report earlier this week where they identified, not by name, but everyone knew who they meant, China as a hostile power or a security threat in regards to their 5G infrastructure. Like I said, China and Huawei were not called out by name, but it's pretty obvious what the report was talking about. This is interesting because of the language that the EU Commission is using to describe China. The use of the word hostile and major security threat here is very telling. Now, this week there were also trade tariffs put on Chinese steel wheels, some tariffs as high as 66%. Now, the issue with steel is a long one, and we don't need to go into it here, but basically there has been friction between China and the EU on the matter of steel. The Chinese have steel overcapacity, and they've been exporting a lot of steel at a loss because of that overcapacity. The Europeans have accused the Chinese of dumping. There are a lot of very politically powerful steel companies in the EU that are unable to compete with the Chinese steel. And so this has been a political issue that has been on the cards for some time now. Now, the European Union here introducing steel tariffs does not necessarily mean the EU is going down a trade war route like the US has. Far from it. Though there will be complications with steel going forward, and there may be additional tariffs that are added on steel, the Europeans have a lot on their plate as it is, including economic slowdown of their own. So the last thing they want to do is get embroiled in a trade war with China. And our final story, look, pork prices. I'm going to bring this up a lot. It is super important. The effect of pork prices, pork supply, and the effect that African swine fever is having on the pork industry in China can have a bigger economic effect than the US-American trade war, and the industry is worth more than bilateral trade between China and the US, the two biggest economies in the world. Now, last week I went into about 3 or 4 minutes unpacking a lot of this. You can go back and watch that video if you want to know more about the situation with pork supply at the moment. But there is one thing that I just want to bring up this time at the end of our video. Look at this character here. This character is called He. It has many meanings in Chinese, but one of its oldest meanings is peace or harmony. Peace or harmony. Now, this character has two radicals. The first is this one here. It means wheat or rice, food basically, a foodstuff. And this character here, this means mouth. The Chinese word for peace and harmony is basically a mouth with food in it. The Chinese understand that, the government understands that, which is why pork supply and the issues of pork supply, food inflation, is the thing that is most likely keeping top policy people and the leadership up at night. Not the trade war, not as much as the slowdown, but pork supply and pork prices. Because the Chinese understand for the last 3,000 years, there has been no social unrest when people have food in their mouths. Right, well that's it. Thank you so much. It's been a crazy week if you're following China this week, but I hope you enjoyed our news here. Thank you so much for watching our update here. I hope you enjoyed it. This is a new channel where basically our team who follow China professionally. We're pulling together our resources and coming up with the biggest stories that you need to know about the Middle Kingdom so you can stay on top of the world's #2 economy. So we need your feedback. Let us know what you think. And also just hit us up in the comments about what you think about each of these stories. Do you agree with our analysis? What do you think about the situation with Blizzard? Do you think this is going to make a big difference, the American reaction or the reaction of gamers? Or do you think they're going to continue to double down on that Chinese market? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and if this was your jam, give us a like, subscribe and hit that bell button. We release one video a week with the top developments, and you can get it straight out of the gate so you can understand China. Okay guys, thank you so much. See you next time.